This paper is part of a larger project on French immigrants to and through the Channel Island of Jersey during the Revolutionary era. Today, my focus is on aspects of economic migration specific to women. In this case, those who sought refuge and forged a livelihood abroad during the Revolutionary Wars. The Channel migration serves as a case study of the larger emigration that included 150,000 or more French people who fled their country between 1789 and 1802. This phenomena differs from other immigrant stories. The Emigrée, however defined by revolutionaries as a teleological figure, never remained fixed in exile. The documentation of aliens located in British territories like Jersey shows a diverse social group whose comings and goings suggest various motives under changing conditions. Recent work on the French emigration has taken a transnational perspective to address the historical problems of borders and border control, military strategies concerning civilians, the administrative management of sequestered property, local policing, international espionage, as well as the relief work of host countries and refugee settlement and repatriation. My own research into the social composition of Jersey's immigrant community reveals how women and men, separated and tethered to one another in chains of migration, made their way to spaces of refuge and opportunity. Temporary residency lengthened to months and years of foreign resettlement. In this period of flux and flow, the fortitude and resourcefulness of immigrants became apparent, particularly for female immigrants, some of whom were solo travelers. Others who made the journey as heads of households with children and servants. They found the means to provide for themselves and their families while abroad, knowing what they could and couldn't do. These women relocated their lives out of necessity. They broke away in the uncertainty of relative freedom. Until recently, early modern historiography held to traditional notions of women in work that underscored the limits of female agency. Women operated within deeply patriarchal society that deprived them of property rights and economic freedom. Rather than independent economic agents, women worked for men as part of a family economy. Their primary role was to serve the needs of the household in a separate sphere. In the past 2 decades, historians have challenged this patriarchal paradigm through groundbreaking scholarship on femmes marchandes publiques, female lordship, and other stories of enterprising women across the social spectrum. The range of economic and legal roles assumed by women within the household yet independent of men demonstrates a greater level of autonomy, responsibility, and equity within the family than has generally been assumed. The many exceptions to this patriarchal structure brought women into the public working world long before revolutionary women took an activist turn. This paper draws on a burgeoning notion of liberty in a period of rupture to argue for women's agency as elements of continuity between the old regime and the revolution. To be sure, the French Revolution was revolutionary in how it ended corporate society and eliminated legal privileges, first in 1789 and then in 1791. The revolution also invested single adult women with full property rights, including equal inheritance. It granted divorce in extreme cases of neglect, abuse, and abandonment. Women may have experienced these radical changes directly. Many more felt the indirect consequences of these newfound liberties. Many entered politics in a new way as revolutionary activists. But as emigrant women, any pursuit of rights and freedom centered on the right to work as much as the right to subsistence. This consciousness, I argue, was predicated on the growing economic opportunities for and legal autonomy of women beginning in the 17th century. The eve of the revolution was a period of economic crisis that went far beyond national debt. There was a crisis in the labor market where many workers saw cuts in wages and a high rise in the cost of food staples. Political reforms and regime change affected landed elites and titled nobility in other ways. The aristocratic reaction that rejected these reforms and peasant unrest that posed direct challenges to the life and property, not to mention the direct attacks on legal privilege, on the night of June 19th, 1790, resulted in an end of honorific titles and pushed many conservative elites to escape a world turning upside down. Even those constitutionalists who hung on through the first phase of the revolution lost sight of its promise within 3 to 4 years. During Jacobin rule, and again under the Directory, France experienced hyperinflation, paper currency lost its value, and shortages were common. The counter-revolution took hold in the Vendée and in Brittany, while the abandoned property of Emigrées had been sequestered, and in many cases sold. In 1791, the revolution revoked citizenship for Emigrées. Anyone who departed after 1789 was an enemy of the nation. In its most radical moment of legislation, any emigrant family member or servant residing in France in an Emigré household was implicated as a suspect. How did people contend with the disruption that the revolution caused for so many households? How might a study of emigration help determine the ways in which enterprising women of all ranks dared to step out and undertake a new life? What resources and effort were involved in the relocation and resettlement? Given that gender, and more particularly the understanding of femininity that framed social and economic status and determined the value given to labor, what actual tasks were women permitted to do? And how does the emigration show us the possibilities and limitations that women faced when seeking a livelihood for themselves and their family? For many working women, 1789 was a call to action. The Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen gave voice to a radical set of propositions. The people's response was to assert their liberty either by joining a movement or running from it. While we know a great deal about the lives of women who stayed, the survival strategies of emigrant women living in exile under the revolution points to a continuation of autonomy and influence among French women as they built their lives and sought resources for themselves and their families until their return. This resourcefulness and resilience, I argue, appears most daringly among the least radical of feminine circles, the female immigrants of 1789 to 1802. Turning now to Jersey, an island of 46 square miles, located only 14 miles from the Cherbourg Peninsula, we have a unique case study to analyze the Channel migration. Jersey was a hub for espionage, a transfer point for émigrés, prisoners, and the military. This sparsely populated island, surrounded by rocky shallows, made entry into the natural harbors difficult, and during the winter months, treacherous. The revolutionary emigration brought tens of thousands of men, women, and children from the shores of Brittany and Normandy to Britain itself, many by way of the Channel Islands. At its height, 25,000 French immigrants sailed to Britain in a single year. While it's difficult to know exactly how many settled in Jersey at one time, the call for French recruits for the counter-revolutionary attack on the Brittany coast in 1795 included 3,500 men and boys from Jersey, leaving behind at least as many women on the island, many of whom would be widowed or fatherless after the failed battle at Quiberon Bay. According to local documentation of Jersey's French immigrants, the biggest waves of migration occurred between the spring of 1791 and the fall of 1792, with smaller peaks in 1794, 95, and 96. This French-speaking island under British control has long served as a site of exile for writers, political leaders, and religious communities such as the Huguenots and the Methodists. Jersey's proximity to Western France's coastline provided a liminal space for temporary asylum seekers during the French Revolution. For many, it became the threshold of emigration, operating as a zone of contact in the Channel migration. From at least one account, Jersey was the more desirable location for war refugees seeking assistance. Their relief funds were generous, and their support systems, which included a hospital and schools for children, encouraged long-term settlement. Most local historians agree that the influx of immigrants to Jersey stimulated their economy. Before the emigration, Jersey was sparsely populated with at most 20,000 inhabitants, a number which would double by the mid-19th century, with improvements to the port of Saint-Aubin. Long known for its maritime industry, Jersey men sailed to Nova Scotia Grand Banks for cod fishing. They built ships to support the overseas trade between the Caribbean, North America, and Europe. Jersey cows were not yet in abundance, but Jersey farmers trafficked French herds to England for cattle traders seeking to avoid entry duties. Farmers were self-sufficient. They invested in orchards and sheep rather than produce grains. The very few artisans that did exist were French Huguenots, including a number of silversmiths and shoemakers. With the flood of émigrés seeking to cross the channel, many boatmen made their living by ferrying people from Saint-Malo and other fishing villages that dot the Brittany coast to Jersey's shores. This influx of émigrés, particularly wealthy ones who brought gold and silver and jewels to Jersey, spurred a speculative housing boom. Businesses began to flourish on the island, beginning with the construction of 2- and 3-story homes, as well as new roads, bulwarks, and a large pier along the southern shore, as seen in this image. The size of the town, Saint-Hélier, doubled. Granite houses were replaced with blocks of apartments and offices. There was also a growing demand for private rooms and boarding houses. This housing industry employed masons, carpenters, and a large number of laborers needed for the enormous projects from both sides of the channel. The professional titles of emigrant workers appear in many of the alien registries of Jersey. We also find a number of seamstresses and washing women who arrived on their own between 1791 and 94, a fact that suggests a level of economic migration to the island. Local advertisements for goods and services also attest to the industrious and enterprising initiatives of Jersey's immigrant population. One ad, published in the spring of 1792, listed a foreigner lately arrived in the island who proposes to teach elementary French, writing, vocal, and instrumental music. An advertisement for another music teacher mentioned his wife, who takes in washing, men's cotton, silk, and woolen stockings, and is prepared to take on any sewing and linen. Numerous ads included other services seeking posts as governesses, nursemaids, and cooks. Some merchants were able to make money by selling valuables brought in by the rising tide of French émigrés. In April 1790, a Mr. Galichan advertised that he would shortly sell by auction at Madame Le Toublin's lodging a great quantity of silver, including 6 pairs of candlesticks and 6 coffee pots. Auctions of books and other personal items were frequent listings in the weekly journal. While this evidence points to a range of enterprises, a more comprehensive look at the emigrant population, according to social rank and profession, highlights the differences in social structure and household composition. What we learn from these lists is not all immigrants in Jersey were landed nobles. A large number of registered aliens included military men of rank. In this particular diagram, we see not only the number of legal professions, military officers, but men who are traveling sometimes in their 50s and 70s, alone or with a lackey, and were given extraordinary relief funds because of their age. Several lists grouped refugees by household that included spouses, adult children, minors, infants, and servants. The vast majority of these households were made up of 2 or 3 members who arrived in Jersey together. In a few cases, families with as many as 8 household members, including servants, emigrated as a group. Nearly a quarter of all households inscribed in the charity rolls listed married women and their household members without a male head. We also find a substantial population of female émigrés traveling alone. 21 out of 137, or about 15%, were solo travelers. These included wives without husbands, some widows, some separated, and young professional women. Alongside these immigrants were members of households who served as domestic help, lackeys, chambermaids, cooks, and governesses. This servant class of women and men made up about 1/3 of the total number of registered aliens, female domestics, slightly outnumbering male ones, as we see in this diagram. And here are some of the lists of the different professions. Domestic servants who remained with their household employers were not always secure in their positions. Those who remained with émigré families, now struggling to feed themselves, could not be assured a wage. In some cases, a master or mistress on the charity rolls sought additional relief funds for her servants. One example comes from a letter written by Madame de Flugles, the wife of the late Vincent Le Flugles, gentilhomme de Bretagne, who petitioned to Jersey's commander, Philippe d'Auvergne, for relief funds for her 4 domestics, appealing to the leader's, quote, sense of justice. Even as we know that many domestics quit their posts during the Revolution and chose not to emigrate, the Alien Registry includes names of servants who emigrated to Jersey on their own. Other evidence points to an economic migration to Jersey that shows some domestics who secured employment at the border of France. One example is illustrated in a personal letter written from Jersey on June 25th, 1791. A female émigrée now settled in Saint-Hélier writes to her mother in Switzerland with news about her journey. She reports how she and her female companion, a governess perhaps, an elderly relative, hired 2 domestic servants while awaiting passage in Saint-Malo, one a femme de chambre and the other a cuisinière. The daughter, having been so pleased with finding a skilled cook, points to the necessity of maintaining a household even in the most adverse circumstances. In conclusion, we see the examination of the Channel migration during this revolutionary era as a diverse group of men and women, many of whom left their homes in search of stability, security, and as this paper demonstrates, opportunity to better themselves and their families. The large population of female emigrants included women who were separated from their spouses, young women traveling with guardians, others traveling alone. All were faced with the challenge of securing a livelihood in a period of uncertainty. The resources they drew upon, the choices they made to support themselves shows resilience and agency within the structured nature of class, status, and gender. By this I mean that they pursued enterprising strategies in a revolutionary present that operated within allowable cultural boundaries. For women of property, it meant turning heirlooms and their personal effects into cash and seeking support for their servants. For women with trade skills, it meant pursuing employment abroad. For other women of social standing, it could mean finding inventive ways to seek an income through feminized professions, such as music and language instruction, textiles, dressmaking, nursing, and childcare. Domestic service, the largest identifiable profession among the emigrant population, became more feminized trade during this era. Jersey and how domestic servants, largely female, were more apt to relocate with families than male servants, or to take the initiative to seek employment abroad on their own. This paper situates these economic strategies within a larger conversation about the opportunity to assert female agency in a context where the rules of patriarchal authority diminish, at least in a temporary absence of men. Yet even as women saw the relative freedom to seek gainful employment or the necessity of monetizing domestic home labor and marketing domestic goods and services, they operated within the gendered forms of acceptable behavior more often than not. This paper also addresses the larger question of how domestic relations, work identity, and revolutionary change intersect. Clearly, ruptures in domestic relations between wives and husbands, servants and their masters and mistresses, upended the lives of many households. The extraordinary conditions of war and political pressures forced many women to pick up and leave their homes. The revolution's social and political fissures that broke apart domestic ties also shifted the possibilities and limitations about family or individual means of subsistence, spurring women in search of a livelihood in new ways through uncharted waters.